panels is in support of Web3athon, which is a hyper-local, people-first hackathon that's taking place over the next 3 months. Each of these themes or challenge areas are things that we're inviting participants from all over the world to consider as the impact they have on their communities. So a couple of things about that panel I really loved is what Charlene was talking about when it comes to water. Water access is something that's definitely a global issue, but the way she's approaching it, right, is through a deep understanding of how water in Texas works. And that's sort of what we're saying when we're talking about hyperlocal. You have to understand the way the system exists in the place where you live before you start thinking about scale. The other thing that was talked about was regulation and sort of the role regulation can play in various pieces of developing your solution. And one thing that's going to come up, we have 2 months in Web3athon that are just dedicated to thinking about the problem you're trying to solve. And so it's a great opportunity to really think, like, damn, why isn't this going to work? Like, is there regulation that's in the way? How can I solve those problems? How can I find people to collaborate with to help address some of those needs? And so I think that being thoughtful about that is going to be so important as we're starting Web3athon and really kicking it off. And finally, we're talking about how we live in an engineered world and how our solutions are going to have to be engineered to many of the problems that we're having today. And when Charlene was talking about biomimicry, it reminded me of one thing Lauren talks about, which is mycelium, which is mushrooms. There's so much to learn from the way the world is today. There's nothing more hyperlocal than our environment the way it is today. But since we're talking about the importance of hyperlocality, another place that's manifested, especially recently, is when it comes to disaster relief and response, which is the final session for today and the 5th of Web3athon's challenges. Joining us today to moderate this panel is Rakia Reynolds. And it's been such a delight to meet Rakia through this process because she's really a champion of creating sustainable and meaningful products in Web3. She's paving the way for those products. She actually introduced us to Sheila Marcello yesterday. I don't know if you had a chance to watch her, but Rakia is paving the way for meaningful projects in Web3 through being an advisor and amplifier of people, products, and places at her firm Sky Blue Media. The other thing that I love about Rakia is she takes a really thoughtful approach to communication and the way inclusivity shows up in communication. So she's going to bring such an important lens to this conversation about disaster relief and response and the way it might manifest on the blockchain. Rakia, come on up. Just talking into it.
Oh, thank you so much. All right, I am so excited about this last panel. I'm going to actually sit down and introduce you to all of the panelists. I think since we only have 25 minutes, just come on out. We have Robbie Greenfield, Antonio Garcia-Martinez, Jane Khodarkovsky, Joseph Thompson, and I'm going to give you all some quick stats about each person, and we're gonna just dive in on this conversation. I wanna just tell you why I'm so passionate and excited to meet all of you. Last year was so my background in the world of communications, I have to do a lot of crisis comms and urgent care communications, and researching what other people do helps to sort of inspire or provoke thought. And so when Trisha asked me to moderate this panel, I went down, the rabbit hole of researching all of you, and you're all fascinating, and I can't wait for everybody to meet you a little more intimately. So Robbie Greenfield, former head of social impact at Consensus. And here's what I love. You deployed one of the world's first crypto-based humanitarian aid programs, Worker Voice program, and grant management programs, included being awarded the U.S. State Department's first blockchain grant. Snaps and claps to you. All right, and then we have Antonio Garcia-Martinez, who also is affectionately called AGM on Twitter by other podcasters. Antonio founded a startup that sold to Twitter, built part of Facebook's early system, wrote a New York Times best-selling memoir about his time in tech, and currently writes and podcasts at the pull request. He's a fellow at the Lincoln Network, not the Lincoln Project. So snaps and claps to you for that. Yes, we definitely cannot mess that up. And Jane is the head of risk and compliance at the Celo Foundation, where she helps Celo achieve its mission of building conditions of prosperity and financial inclusion for all. Prior to the Celo Foundation, Jane was a trial attorney and human trafficking finance specialist with the U.S. Department of Justice. And I told Jane she has done a very good job of keeping her profile clean because I found no research and no videos of her online. So snaps and claps to Jane for that. And lastly, Joseph Thompson is the CEO of Aid Tech, the first company in the world to use blockchain technology for international and disaster relief aid. Aid Tech to date has provided digital ID to over 400,000 users globally. Tell us if those numbers have changed, and delivered over $300 million in aid. And Joseph is also the UN Sustainable Development Goals pioneer for blockchain technology. So, ooh, y'all doing it. Y'all are really doing it. So here's the thing. My first question to you all is, you all have fascinating paths and have taken, some of you have taken some linear approaches to solving challenges and doing the work that you do. Would love for you all to give everyone the story behind your glory and how you got here. Want to go first? Go ahead.
I can be real quick. And so I come from an activist background and also an engineer. And so really, I got into blockchain technology mainly around the time that Trayvon Martin was murdered. So I got into it a little bit before then, but in terms as a builder, that's when I started to map, okay, how can I use my engineering ability to help my community, as a black man in the United States, but also the diaspora more generally. And so at the time, obviously, there was no full-time blockchain anything. And so, I had forays at Goldman and Cisco and other corporates until I had landed at Consensus. And really, it was just, again, how can you make dApps that actually have pragmatic value? And I was talking to Joseph just about this. I think that is the thing that's going to be as lasting as anything within the space. And that's given me the opportunity to work with amazing organizations, such as multinational NGOs like Oxfam and Red Cross and others, but then also just meet amazing people within the communities that we're affecting and change the way that we create those tools. And so that's a very quick summary. All comes from trying to be as, impactful to those who are, like me or, who have come from backgrounds like myself in terms of being a part of underserved communities.
I want to quickly ask you, Robbie, for people, and I know we're streaming, and there are folks that may not understand some of the terminology that we're using in the world of Web3. There's DeFi, and you just talked about dApps. Talk to us about what that is and how people can utilize them.
Yeah, absolutely. So dApps is just a short term for a decentralized application. So any blockchain-based application. In our context, it was decentralized applications that could be used in rural environments, either to facilitate humanitarian aid, but also to make tamper-proof evidence in Syria. A lot of different use cases, but the through line between all of them is, are they accessible? Can they be used? And do they require as little technical literacy as possible? Because the communities that you are deploying these solutions into don't have the benefit of the doubt of internet access or the best smartphones or all the other things that would be expected of a lot of the applications that you see, unfortunately, at Consensus. And so, that was our main focus. Yeah.
Thank you for breaking that down. Antonio?
Yeah, so like you mentioned, I have a background in tech, but what landed me here I think was not a background in tech. It was my decision in early March, during the early part of the Ukrainian war, to actually go to Ukraine and actually report from there and see kind of what it was like, despite knowing no local language and, as you can tell from my last name, not being from the region. And I have a lot of impressions from that experience, but one of them, just to paint you a picture of what it's like, for example, to stand on the Polish border and watch the Ukrainian refugees come. A typical Ukrainian refugee is a woman, typically trailing 1 to 3 kids, potentially a pet, potentially an older relative, and bringing a little rolly bag like what you maybe put on your carry-on on your flight, and that's all they have in the world. They're literally, for a bunch of reasons, they don't bring their cars across, they typically walk across. So they walk across with their family, a rolly bag, and nothing else. Imagine if you were forced to abandon your lives, what would you put in that rolly bag, right? My parents fled Cuba. They also had the equivalent of that experience when they were children. Crypto obviously can play a role in that. The other thing I would say from that experience I think is relevant here, the reaction from the local Europeans in terms of aiding the Ukrainians is incredible. So that Ukrainian refugee comes along alone, but what do they find? They find endless NGOs, everyone from Jose Andres and the World Central Kitchen to even local villagers who just come and set up a soup kitchen for refugees and basically self-organize a response to what is this enormous humanitarian catastrophe. It's difficult to do with a lot of traditional financial tools. For example, friend of a friend is from ex-Uber, group of ex-Uber people. One of them is Ukrainian. He went back and helped sourcing aid. PayPal would block all the cash transmissions. Of course, it looks a little sketchy, right? It's like suddenly out of the blue, this PayPal account is getting tens of thousands of dollars. That was legitimate. He was buying non-lethal aid for Ukraine, but it basically got shut down by PayPal. And so I think in those situations when everything normal kind of falls apart, what do you rely on? What tools of because humans actually, it's weird. Everyone thinks everything turns into like a Mad Max apocalypse when everything goes to hell. That's not true, actually. People actually self-organize and try to find solutions to the very human problems. And I think crypto can be one of those tools. Because again, transferring value around, like if you can't transfer value around, it's hard to make food and clothes appear halfway around the world, which is what you need to do. So yeah, I think in the West, we're not often reminded of that because we're not in the situations the Ukrainians are in. But I think something like that serves as a reminder of what crypto can provide.
Yeah, Jane.
So I was the nonlinear, probably example of getting to crypto. I spent the majority of my career as a prosecutor investigating and prosecuting money laundering and financial crimes, specifically for human trafficking, human rights violations, and child exploitation. And what was fascinating to me was how you can use blockchain and the transparency that it provides to really find who is behind the crime, because it's immutable. It's always going to be there. It's not like cash or prepaid cards or debit cards that are much harder for us to trace. But at the same time, I also had victims who we wanted to become survivors, and I like to call thrivers. We want them to have access and become not re-victimized. And one of the things that was most difficult was allowing them access to traditional finance for some of the same reasons that Antonio mentions that plagues people who are refugees or asylees who may not have identification or whose credit scores may have been wrongly impacted by the crime that was why they were the victim. And one of the amazing things about virtual currency and the work around digital ID is what I think inspires me about the really amazing changes, transformative changes it could have for communities that don't have access to that now. And on the other side, I also looked at supply chains and corporate traceability of supply chains, or what corporations say they can and can't trace. And I think there's a lot of good that can come from using blockchain to identify where that cocoa is coming from in Africa that people are eating their M&Ms or chocolate bars here, and really get to how do we improve the lives of people, not just in the United States, because we are privileged to have a traditional finance that we can rely on. Many other worlds do not have that. And so I'm inspired by that. I'm very proud to be here on this panel. And one of the things that really drew me to Celo was its mission and helping other developers who are mission aligned really build on this protocol.
Yeah, thank you.
So how I got into this space was, my background's in banking and telco, but in 2009 I ran an event in the Sahara Desert called the Marathon des Sables. It's a horrible 150-mile one race in the desert. Don't do it. It's really horrible. But what I did was I raised a lot of money for charity. It was, people were very, very helpful. They raised over $100,000. So I gave that money to a charity, and about 6 months later, one of my main donors says, where's that money gone? What's the impact? I went back to that charity, and the money had gone, basically, all gone. There was no way to verify anywhere where it went. So I was quite embarrassed to go back to my funder and say, I don't know where the money's gone. But fast forward then, that was 2011, fast forward 2015, was thinking, if Google built a search engine, could we build a transparency engine essentially? So what we did was we worked with the Irish Red Cross, and we got another donation from the same donor years ago, and we gave out aid to 500 Syrian refugees in Lebanon. And we were able to top up each of their vouchers with $20. They were able to redeem it in the store. Within the first hour we had like 50 fake transactions, people trying to duplicate the transactions, which was perfect because we could see, okay, this is working, right? So that's how we kind of got into it. We were saying, the core of what we do is merging identity and money. And Sustainable Development Goal 16.9 says give everybody legal ID by 2030. So that was kind of the core common thesis of what we've been building since. But yeah, I always say ATech was born by mistake in the Sahara Desert. And that's how we kind of got into this space.
Look, Sometimes the best things come out of the biggest mistakes. So snaps and claps to you. I say snaps and claps a lot, y'all. Sorry. So here's the thing, Antonio. You recently, I was listening to a podcast that you were on, and your brain moves so quickly. You can just tell by the way that you talk. And you had said, when I slowed it down, that the internet has really, really dissolved lots of trust in institutions, government, corporations, and that Web3, which I found this to be really interesting, that Web3 and blockchain has the opportunity to get people to agree on various states of the world so that we can effectively talk to each other. And this question is for all of you. I just wanted to use what I had heard Antonio say. Do you all feel that the use of blockchain to manage disasters will lessen the friction and help to create trusted partnerships among first responders, businesses, and community stakeholders to ensure that the right people respond quickly and purposefully in a crisis? Antonio, you want to start since I called you out?
I guess so, yeah. Yeah, I mean, I still believe that, right? I think, you know, I worked at Facebook back in the day, and I think the great hope is that it would bring people together. And I think to a certain degree it has, but I do think the internet is kind of a universal solvent that I think does destroy trust in a lot of institutions. And I think part of the reason why Web3 is interesting and I go to conferences like this is because it feels very generative in the sense that it's creating other alternative institutions that are potentially much more transparent than the existing sort of Web2 framework. And so to me, I know like trustlessness is often bandied about as like a term of art inside the Web3 world, but it's trustlessness with the goal of actually creating transparency, which in the end does create trust. And so that's one of the things that excites me about Web3. I mean, there's a lot of tech there that's also very cool, but it's not Web2 and it's not the same players that we're used to in Web2.
I think for just even focusing on Celo and what we talk about technology, it's a mobile first protocol. So the idea was to give people access even if you don't have a very sophisticated smartphone. And to go back to Ukraine and how people are documenting and communicating about what is happening is through their phones. And I think that we can use blockchain to also ensure that in real time there is trust, because you can see if you are donating money where it's going. If you are paying your workers, you can see where it's going. So I think trust is built. It has to be transparent, but it has to be a two-way street so that there is buy-in. And if you say you're going to do something, it's all available and transparent. So I hope, yes.
I would also agree, though. I do think that there are some traditional aspects of anti-money laundering laws and KYC that create huge issues with regards to ensuring that this next generation of financial tools can actually be leveraged in a way in which is not seen as criminal. So for example, I mean, obviously, and I mean, to Joseph's earlier comment, like, we know now from, many programs deployed that you can leverage blockchain technology to enable 100% transparent humanitarian aid. That's a fact. But the issue is that at scale, when you're talking about disaster aid situations which need millions of dollars deployed in last mile environments that may be in countries that are, on, banned lists or have certain economic sanctions levied upon those regions, that those individuals who are receiving that aid via either an NFC card or a USSD wallet, whichever, device that they have available to them, that they can do so and either off-ramp to their local currency or engage with a merchant, on a similar chain or, similar platform to get what they need. And right now, the biggest issue to that is that there are certain requirements from traditional financial institutions, which usually serve as the bedrock, of these platforms, at least in terms of compliance and, legally allowing that platform to exist, that require things that those individuals don't have. ID is a huge part of that, Social Security number or the equivalent. And so that's, super frustrating. I know that, AidTech has been kind of pioneering what the next generation of ID looks like for that reason. But it's something that it is incredibly limiting to ensuring that becomes the norm rather than an exception, in some of these, piloted programs that are looking to scale.
So we actually did a project for disaster relief here in the U.S. with a brilliant organization called St. Vincent de Paul Disaster Response. And they work all over the U.S. And basically we worked with a project there in, I think it was Florida a couple of years ago before COVID, that St. Vincent de Paul will give this thing called, they have a program called House in the Box, which is like $25,000 to, when a family's house gets flooded, to buy table and chairs and so on. But the problem is the logistics, and if the roads are down, telecommunication systems are down, whatever. So it's a very manual process. So what we've been working with them is, how do we create a wallet for the survivor, as you mentioned earlier on, that survivor self-verifies them on the, or self-provisions. These organizations have to verify this user, but that user will then have a credential they can reuse again and again and again. So now they can just top up the individuals where they can actually go to a Walmart or wherever to actually buy the products that they need. And then you've got the transparency of using blockchain. We're actually going to ramp up this pilot project with them, I think, in Tennessee in August, which is really, really cool. So, like, there's some brilliant organizations here. Like, you have FEMA. You know, it's unfortunately, and this sounds horrible, but it's true, natural disasters are a growing business, if you want to put it that way, right? So how do you serve people quicker? So, you know, you can pull in oracles from Chainlink, and you can have forecast-based financing that can actually trigger automated payouts to verified wallets depending on weather conditions, which has never been possible to do before. So there's some really great things that need to be done, but I think it's a marriage of Web 2 and Web 3. You can't have one without the other, from, you know, the conversations that we've been having. So, but again, it adds that layers of transparency and enables the individuals to prove who they are with credentials they've got from an organization previously.
And you'd hope that those credentials can then, since they're verified, be used in traditional finance. So you need that bridge to accept it. And I think that's where those partnerships need to form.
And just add on to that point, so with these end individuals or survivors, when their house gets flooded, they don't have any like proof of who they are or the funding, but if they show their credentials, they can get insurance and they get payouts quicker to rebuild and have better resiliency across the nation here. So a lot of innovations, you know, some great organizations here in the US that is doing it.
Speaking of, you know, lots of organizations, what do you all think about, you know, the fact that so many communities are creating their own blockchain solutions for emergency management? Do you think that those efforts will hinder relief efforts, or do you think that there is a time that you see one global disaster management system that will be in place for emergencies of all sizes?
I think that, I mean, I think it's good, one, that you have different modalities in terms of how money is collected and then dispersed. You know, so for example, I mean, obviously there are, you know, impact DAOs that, you know, have decentralized funders, and they, you know, organize around community grants. And you have like things like the Giving Block that take, you know, on-ramps from credit cards and bank accounts, you know, to settle donations, you know, in cryptocurrencies. I think that there are a lot of aspects of the, you know, kind of philanthropic value chain that require different modalities, and thus, you know, enable opportunities for all these different tools. I do think, though, that as, you know, regulation starts to come in full force, and obviously we, in the context of the United States, we have the research proposals from the executive order made earlier this year that are going to come toward the December-January timeframe, and I do think that that's going to greatly change the context of what's allowable, right? So you'll likely not see, you know, a lot of those tools just using cryptocurrencies more generally. There probably will be an increasing preference towards stablecoins, and even more towards stablecoins that are more institutionalized. And so in that case, like USDC is probably going to be favored in a lot of different ways, and I think the future for other forms of collateralized stablecoin are to be determined. And so that's where I think, you know, there's going to be a bit more pause or tentativeness in terms of which solutions use which types of infrastructure. I do think, however, that one of the biggest things that needs to be solved before we get to a global solution, you know, are on and off ramps across a lot of these countries, and that's something that like Umoja Labs focuses on. Like, how can you go from USDC to like eFloat and M-Pesa, you know, for example, so that, because the fact of the matter is that you can't use most of these cryptocurrencies in any pragmatic way in terms of purchasing the goods on the ground in the disaster aid context unless it's a conditional program in which that stablecoin acts like as a voucher. And so that's a big thing. I think outside of those different elements working toward a global solution, the last obstacle is just human coordination. You know, it's who gets the custody of the money, who gets the main grant, and the politics around that. And that's a very real obstacle to enabling something that technically I do think is feasible today.
I think education is also important, and different communities may face different challenges. And I think it's important to learn what works and what doesn't, and then apply it So I don't know if we're going to have one global perspective, but at the same time, I think we can do a lot more to incentivize communities through community banking or other ways that support each other. So it's growth and rebuilding from inside their own communities, and hopefully that grows beyond into, in the United States, it could be your county or a town, and then it goes to your state level. But that coordination also requires us, I think, in this space to be better educators about how important this technology can be and how it can be applicable. And I think going back to the regulation, you need thoughtful regulation. Just like every community is different, every product is different. A DAO will be different from an NFT. Maybe the NFT can be used to improve climate change and prevent certain catastrophes that really impact communities that need to rebuild. So I think it's like you can't use one brush for all of the strokes of the world and all of the different complexities that people live with.
Antonio, were you going to say something?
I feel so out of my league with people who are actually dealing with real disasters here. The only other personal experience I would say here is another weird reporting trip I did. I went to Cuba to report on how the internet works there, or rather doesn't work there by and large. But one of the interesting things is that Bitcoin adoption actually in Cuba is actually pretty good, because it's kind of a long story, but there's a two-tier currency system. There's a hard currency that's exchangeable for $1, and then there's the local funny money that's exchangeable for nothing, basically. And so local people often have to use something like Bitcoin Lightning to actually just do everyday trade. It's not some sort of exotic thing to get money back in or out. It's literally just pay $30 for something, because they don't actually have access to hard currency. But as soon as they started getting internet on their phones, which in Cuba is relatively recent, suddenly you would start seeing Bitcoin adoption.
Do I think there'll be a global relief management organization? Not a hope. If you look at regulation in Europe, they're trying to ban Bitcoin mining and unhosted wallets, so you can just forget that idea altogether. I think it will be driven by startups. I think it will be driven by innovation, and those organizations that want to, USDC and different on-ramps. But again, the most important person here is the end user. How can they get what they need instantly, depending on weather conditions? So that's where the innovation comes on. I don't think a unified body will work, personally.
Jane, you mentioned something, and I know we are running out of time, but you mentioned something that made me think about education. Robbie, I heard you talk about your background. I was laughing because you were talking about growing up, in a Black household, how education and things were important. But when you talked about, your background in engineering and getting an MBA, do you think that, as, all of these people are up on the stage, do you think that as things become a little more nuanced and a little more complex, that we are going to go the route of traditional education for people to fill seats like this? Or are we going to take other routes, like how folks are just doing learn to earn or play to earn in the world of Web3 to tackle the most important solutions that we're trying to change?
I think in the American context, unfortunately, college and master programs are losing a lot of their value. And this has been happening for a while. The main reason is just because they're not teaching things that are pragmatic. You don't even learn how to do taxes in high school, or college, actually, unless you take an accounting class. And so just we're not learning a lot of the things that are necessary to manage yourself as an adult. I think that a lot of the knowledge in order to propel yourself as an entrepreneur are going to be found in other places. And so I just encourage people to, crowdsource research online. I do think that the time for earn to learn or earn to engage or vice versa is a long way off because the user interfaces aren't there. But I do think that they have an opportunity to engage communities that might have otherwise not have been interested in things that might be important to being able to build later on. But fundamentally, I think academics traditionally is going to have to change toward that model to be more useful. Otherwise, I think trade schools and boot camps are a much better ROI in terms of the world that we're going into.
Okay, real quick. One tip or tool that you can leave the audience with before we exit the stage in about 60 seconds. One tip or tool.
Focus on user experience and product, because it's pretty terrible in this space right now. Honestly, it's awful. So.
Be open-minded, because if someone had told me when I was in law school, to the point of education, practical, represent victims, talk to people who have experience, but be open-minded, because this space is growing so quickly and there's so much good that could come of it. And I think innovation is really important to building it and being thoughtful about it.
Joseph, you kind of took what I was going to say, but I'll expand on it and say, coming from the world in which growth is a major focus like Facebook, like people are not going to use, normies are not going to use Web3 because it's Web3 and it's cool and it's wallets and crypto. They're going to use it because they want to do cool shit on it. So build cool shit that actually beats what you can do on Web2, and then you'll see adoption go up.
Yeah, I would say user design and partnerships. You know, on the partnership side, you know, look what's around you before building, and because oftentimes you'll at least find some components that will help you along the way. So.
Well, thank you to all of you, and thank you to Cradle for bringing these amazing people up here. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon. And I think, Catherine, you're coming back to the stage? Oh, okay. Thank you.
I'll take your microphone.
Thank you.
Oh, can we give this crew a round of applause for making this programming so incredible and being really the grease between the gears making all of this possible. Oh, what an amazing session. I think it's so wonderful that we have people on stage who've seen and experienced and understand some of the problems that we're having when it comes to disaster relief and response. But I think the one thing that really spoke to me during that session was we can't have one brush that's going to fix every problem. You have to have something that's really relevant to the problems that you're seeing in the world in order for it to actually make an impact. The real reason we have all of these panels today is, one, to provide a foundation for people at Web3athon to understand our various hyperlocal themes. But on the flip side, it's to have real conversations about what is Web3, to think critically about it and be thoughtful about the applications as we're developing them. Our next session, and it's our last thing to round out the day, is kind of a different take on closing remarks. I can stand up here and say nice things about the programming all day, but that's not going to serve any of you. We are inviting Dave Lewis, who Lauren met while doing field work at NFT ATL, who's an up-and-coming thought leader in the space, and is going to share with us and have a really exciting conversation to make us think about what did we learn today? What open questions are there? And then Lauren Sirota, our co-founder and design director of Cradle, is going to help facilitate that conversation. So Lauren, if you can come up on stage. He's also just getting set up, which is great. Some what type of music? Hold music. Do, 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 do. There we go.